said she was seeing ghosts and that she was psychic and wanted to leave. And in my training, that's what I was taught is a sign of somebody being psychotic. And she said, I'm getting a really good reading about you right now. Do you mind if I tell you what I see? And I see that you have a husband who's a chemist and he's applying for a job right now in 2 different cities. There was no way she could know. We went on to move to San Diego, and I went on to have a daughter. And I was called to do an evaluation of this woman who wanted to sign out of the hospital against medical advice. And that was my role there at the hospital, was to do psychiatric consults on the medical and surgical floors. And I went in to see this woman, and the staff had already determined that she was mentally ill because she said she was seeing ghosts and that she was psychic and wanted to leave. And in my training, that's what I was taught is a sign of somebody being psychotic. And when I went in to see her, one of the first things she said to me is, "Oh, I'm seeing all this ghosts, and it's freaking me out. I really want to leave." And I said, "Well, yeah, I imagine if there's going to be ghosts anywhere, they'd be in a hospital. A lot of people die here." And she goes, "Yeah." She goes, "And I'm also psychic, and I know my tests are going to come back normal." And back then, we did blood work in order to find out if somebody had a heart attack, and it took a day or 2 to get the results back. And so we didn't have those results back yet. And she said, "So I want to leave." And I said, "Well, I really love to talk to you a little bit more about this." And I really wanted to just gain her cooperation to stay rather than just sign the paperwork and commit her to stay. And she looked at me and she said, "I'm getting a really good reading about you right now. Do you mind if I tell you what I see?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." I just thought it was really interesting that she would say that. And I thought, it's good. I love to build rapport with people. And I said, "Sure, go ahead." And she goes, "Wow," she says, "I'm seeing your aura, and you've got this white light around you, like Jesus." And I'm going, "Yeah, right." And then she says, "And I see that you have a husband who's a chemist, and he's applying for a job right now in 2 different cities." And I was like, my husband was an MD, PhD biochemist, and he was applying for a postdoctorate in 2 different cities right then. And I was like, "Oh, really?"
That got your attention, huh?
That got my attention. And then she said, I said, what cities, are you talking about? She says, "Well, in his heart of hearts, he wants to go to one of them, but you're actually going to end up at the other one." And now she had my curiosity because he and I had met when we were medical students together at Johns Hopkins, and he was 13th generation Baltimorean. I knew that that's where he wanted he really wanted to go back there. And the other place he was applying was UCSD. And she said, I said, "Well, what city are we going to end up in?" She said, "Well, name some cities." So I named about 10 cities. And she goes, "San Diego, that's where you'll be." And she said, "And you'll have a daughter while you're there." And she just started telling me all of these things about my current situation and my future that there was no way she could know. And I was able to talk her into staying because she really liked me. And she said, "Well, if you come back tomorrow, I'll stay." And so she stayed. Her test came back normal, and she left. And we went on to move to San Diego, and I went on to have a daughter. And it was one of those things that just, it was one of those things where it was so life-changing because I went into this field wanting to understand the brain and consciousness. That's why, originally when I went to medical school, I was going to become a neurosurgeon because they were the ones who were mapping the brain during surgery by doing recordings from the brain and stimulating parts of the brain during an operation because they wanted to make sure that they didn't remove areas that somebody needed for functioning. So if you're doing neurosurgery, you really want to know for this individual, and everybody's brain is slightly different. You want to know for them what their functionality is. And so I thought, this would be a good way to map out the brain and do good in the world. So my goal was to understand, the brain and consciousness and how does it all work. And I thought, if what she did is real, and I knew it was real because it was, I experienced it firsthand, then any model for how the brain and consciousness work is going to be incorrect if it can't account for this. And so I started doing research to try to find, has anybody else reported these phenomena? And in 1995, when some of the remote viewing work started to get declassified, that really, piqued my interest again. And I said, look at this. Military intelligence funded this kind of research for a long time.
Yeah.
And they had some really fascinating results. And so it was after that I decided that I was going to put my own energy into trying to figure it out.
That's interesting. That happened. That happened to my wife before, and she recorded it. This is before we ever met. We didn't even know each other, and several years later, what did we do? We did something, and we got connected to, I don't know, somebody that was like, you should try this. And I tried it and recorded it. And I was like, I'm not really buying into this. He was like, oh, you've seen explosions. And I'm like, I'm a Navy SEAL. Of course I've seen explosions. Try again. And I wasn't open to it, at all. And I am a Christian, so I'm gonna get a bunch of shit about this in the comments, but whatever. It is what it is. And so me and my wife started talking about it, and she was talking about an event she went to in New York. Who's the big medium there? Do you know who I'm talking about?
John Edwards?
No, it was a woman, I think.
Oh, the Long Island medium?
Yes. She was talking, we just had like a dinner conversation about this, and she started telling me about the Long Island medium. And they went to some type of a show there, and there was this woman there. They were like, "Oh, I'm getting these messages," and all these people were raising their hand, like, "No, not you. No, it's not you. It's not you." And she went on to say some other stuff, and she's like, "No, that's not it either." And she goes, "Somebody in here." I can't remember exactly how it went, but basically it was like, this person misses so-and-so, and he wants you to know everything's okay, and he knows that you go into the closet and spray your dad's old cologne so that you can remember him. And the woman that went there with my wife, like, broke down bawling, like, was like, I can't believe that this happened. And then she had spoken to a psychic long time ago, years before we met, and the woman that gave her the reading gave her my initials. Says, you're gonna marry somebody with the initials, my initials, and then you're gonna move to this place, which we wound up moving to. And she said, she didn't even remember it, actually. She was like, we were talking about having the fact that she had done that she had talked to a psychic, and I was like, this is crazy. I don't believe in any of that stuff. And then she's like, actually, I think I recorded it. So we dug through her computer and pulled it up, and sure as shit, she was like, I didn't even remember this, but she's in there and called out my initials, said we're going to move, to Tennessee, and said some other stuff that's actually happening right now. We're in process, right? I don't want to go into it because it's private, but she had called like all these things, and I'm sitting there like, you didn't remember this? And she's like, no, she's like, I didn't remember it, but here it is. And And that really kind of like opened my mind to it. And I was like, oh shit, well, maybe there is something to this. And then, then the rest is history. That's when I started bringing in people, remote viewers and psychics and stuff to hear their stories and try to understand how it works. Still have no idea how it works, but so that led you into, I mean, did you ever do it again before we move on?
Ever do what again?
Have you ever had another reading?
Oh, well, so when I met Gary Schwartz from the University of Arizona at the time, and this was back in like 2004, 2005, he was doing research on mediums. And he said to me, have you ever, had a reading by a medium? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'm testing these mediums and I want to, certify them, and so I need somebody independently to just, look at them. Would you be interested in a free reading? And I said, oh, okay, sure. And so this woman called, we had to set up phone call, and she called me and she said, this guy named George is so excited to talk to you. And I said, George? And she said, yeah, he's your grandfather, isn't he? And I thought, like, no, I don't have a grandfather named George. And then she said, oh, well, he's pretty insistent that, he's here to talk with you. And I said, and then I thought about it for a second. I thought, well, wait a minute. My daughter's father's father was named George, and he had passed over. And I said, could it be my daughter's grandfather? And she said, yeah, that's who it is. He wants to tell you, a few things. Oh, well, that's interesting. And then the next person that she said showed up was my grandmother, Minnie. And the way she described her was just totally consistent with my grandmother. She described her as somebody that would follow you around with like a Windex bottle and wipe up, any like little fingerprints and whatnot. That was exactly my grandmother. She was very, very, very fastidious, clean. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And then one of these autistic individuals that I do research with recently just spontaneously told me, he got a reading on me. And I was like, oh, who's here? And he says, well, it's your half aunt. And my father had a half sister. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because that's a very specific thing to say, and most of us don't have half aunts. And then the other person that she said showed up to say something to me was she said your grandfather by marriage, and his name is Harold, and my step grandfather's name was Harold.
Wow.
So I really think that what's happening now is that people are...
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.